れではパネル講演会を始めます。アジア系アメリカ人リーダー訪日プログラムで来日されましたのは、壇上にいらっしゃいますこちらの6人の州議会議員の皆様です。日本では間もなく選挙ですので、あらかじめ予知していらしたかのようなタイミングでの来日ですけれども、多くのことをきっとご覧になってお帰りになるのではないかと思います。今回の訪問では関西にもいらっしゃいましたし、東京でも日本の各界の主要な方たちと意見交換をなさいました。このパネルではそれぞれの州議会議員の皆様のライフストーリー、これまでどのように過ごしてこられたのかということとともに、今のアメリカ、そしてこれからの日米関係をどう見ていらっしゃるのかということも伺いたいと思っています。質問用紙がお手元にあるかと思いますので、どうぞ早めに質問をお書きの上、担当のスタッフにお渡しください。たくさんご紹介したいと思います。そしてこの皆様の席順なんですけれども、アメリカの東から西の順番でおかけでいらっしゃいます。まずはじめに5分弱でそれぞれのどんな生い立ちがあって経験をして今日ここにいらっしゃるのかということをお話しいただきたいと思います。So first to speak today is State Representative Roddy Mom, Massachusetts State Legislature. Please.
Thank you, Ms. Doden. Well, good afternoon. Thank you. It is truly an honor to be here today. I want to thank the U.S. Japan Council, the National Asian Pacific American Caucus, State Legislator, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for allowing me to take part in this delegation. It's difficult for me to tell my family history. In 1982, I immigrated to the United States to arrive in the frigid climate of Duluth, Minnesota, as a very scared 12-year-old that spoke not a word of English. I was lucky to have escaped the killing field of Cambodia and still have some of my family intact. War-torn Cambodia lost over 2 million of its citizens, 1/3 of the population, in the Khmer Rouge genocide of the 1970s. It was a horror and a nightmare that can never be forgotten. I thank my parents, my mother, my late father, who sacrificed everything and went through untold dangers to give their children a new life in the safety of America. We are so thankful to the United States and the city of Lowell for providing us with safety and the opportunity for a new life. For this, I truly say, God bless America in all its ways, with its many leaders and citizens. I am fortunate to be living the American dream because of this opportunity that America has afforded to me. I strive each day to give back to my community and country. I decided to run for office because I believe in our democracy. I believe that one voice can represent the voices of many and become a part of the solution. I was elected the first Cambodian American state representative in America in 2015. It is an honor to be a part of the Massachusetts General Court, the second oldest democratic deliberative body in the world. Thank you. And with that, I want to introduce Representative Clarence.
Thank you, Roddy. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is Clarence Lamb, and I'm a state delegate from the Maryland General Assembly. It's an honor to be here before all of you, not only to represent the great state of Maryland, but also to share my personal journey in the hopes that it will serve as an inspiration to many of you. As a second-generation Chinese American, I was born in Pennsylvania, in a city called Allentown, about an hour northwest of Philadelphia. My parents met in the United States, and like many, had immigrated to the country in hopes of a better life. My mother was born in Taiwan, and although her family was originally from China, my grandfather was a colonel in the Kuomintang, where he commanded a unit of jeeps. And by fortune of his prior military service, he was able to escape to Taiwan when the communists took over China in 1949. My father's family similarly fled communist China by escaping to Hong Kong. A few years later, my grandfather made his way by boat to New York City, where he worked long, hard hours every day in a dry cleaning store before saving enough to bring his entire family, including my father, to the United States. It was around this time that my mother immigrated to California to earn a college degree. And after settling in Pennsylvania, they raised myself and my two younger brothers. My father was a mechanical engineer, and my mother took care of us at home. As the oldest child of three, I saw my parents' early struggles to become fluent in English, to be able to purchase their first home, to support three growing boys, and it was through this lens that it would occasionally dawn on me that we were truly fortunate to be living in the United States. Whether it was a good-paying job, an excellent education, the chance to speak their own views and to express their own beliefs without fear, or the rewards of working hard to ensure that their children had a brighter future than them. We benefited generously from all these opportunities in our adopted country, and it was that sense of responsibility and duty, particularly as a second generation acutely aware that others were not as fortunate as my family, to give back to this community that had given so much to my family, that instilled in me the importance of public service. And it was that sense of community service that I carried throughout my academic and professional career. I felt the urge to care for others, which led me to pursue medicine, but it was my desire to serve our community that fueled my interest in government and in policy. In college, I brought these seemingly incongruent paths together by double majoring in biology and political science, and in medical school, I decided to specialize in preventive medicine, also known as public health, which brought together my interests in medicine and policy by focusing on interventions intended to improve the health of a population as a whole. As I completed my medical training, it was never my intention to run for office. I'd assumed that I would get involved in health policy and politics on the side, perhaps advising a candidate serving as a legislative director for health, or getting involved in health advocacy in addition to my primary responsibility of seeing patients and treating patients. But in 2013, the incumbent legislators that represented my district retired suddenly, creating an unexpected opening to serve in the Maryland House of Delegates. I was not a natural candidate, and I gave my decision to run a lot of thought. As I reflected back on my childhood days, I recalled that my achievements were not only possible because of those who served and sacrificed before me, and it rekindled that long-time sense of responsibility to give back to my community and the country that had provided me so much opportunity. Now, as one of only 7 Asian Americans serving in the Maryland General Assembly, and as the only Chinese American serving in the Maryland House of Delegates, that sense of responsibility continues. And as one of only 3 physicians in the legislature, I am grateful to have found the niche that balances my role as a member of the faculty of Johns Hopkins, where I direct the training of preventive medicine residents, and able to translate the tremendous knowledge and research being generated at academic centers like Hopkins into legislation that make an impact on the health and well-being of our population. And in closing these days, I'm often asked to speak to audiences to inspire them, particularly our young people, to get involved in community service. And I remind them that while nearly all of us come from humble beginnings, it's our thoughts and beliefs that eventually determine who we are. For me, I was driven by the belief that I owe it to my adopted country to serve and to give back to our community just as it had given to me and my family. In the end, it's our own thoughts and beliefs that make each one of us who we are as individuals. And so as I close, I'd like to thank our hosts here, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the U.S. Japan Council and so many others who made this trip possible for organizing this exchange. And I leave you with these parting words of wisdom. Watch your thoughts as your thoughts become your words. Watch your words as your words become your actions. Watch your actions as your actions become your habits. And watch your habits as your habits become your character. And watch your character as your character defines your destiny. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Senator Brian Shiozawa from the great state of Utah.
Good afternoon. I'm grateful to be part of the Asian American Leadership Delegation. I bring you greetings from the great state of Utah. Our state is known as the Beehive State. Now, this derives from the honeybee, which is known for its industry, and how it is essential for growth. The first Mormon pioneers who settled in Utah were busy, like the honeybee. And that tradition of hard work and industry continues today. I'm from Salt Lake City, the capital city. I'm Sansei, third-generation Japanese American. My grandparents emigrated about 1900 from the Shizuoka area. They settled and raised their families in southern Idaho, and my father raised cattle and grew potatoes, a crop for which Idaho was famous. I went to college at Stanford and did medical school at the University of Washington, and I did residency at the University of Utah, which brought me to Utah. I'm a Utah State Senator in my second term. Several years ago, I served as the president of the Utah Medical Association, and I've often found myself on Capitol Hill advocating for patients and for doctors. And I realized in order to have real influence, I had to be inside the actual chamber. And so I ran for the state senate in my district. Now, my district's a great district. It's also a swing district, meaning the split between Republicans and Democrats. And so I have the benefit of really hearing it from both sides. This is my first experience in public office, and it's rewarding, challenging, and filled with opportunity to make change. I'm an emergency physician. I've been very involved in healthcare during my years on the Hill. I serve on Health and Human Services Committee, the Social Services Appropriations Committee, and on the Health Reform Task Force. And as you may have heard, in Utah and in our nation, we're faced with a number of big healthcare issues. We need to decide what to do with the current Obamacare mandates, rising healthcare costs, homelessness, and an opioid painkiller crisis. Now, I hope to gain some perspective and hopefully some solutions, not only from my fellow delegates, but also from you, on how Japan deals with these very crucial issues. For example, Japan ranks high in longevity, low in obesity, and has little of the drug problems that we in the U.S. face daily. So let us reason and learn together. I'm chair of the Utah State Business Economic Development Labor Appropriations Committee. Now, this committee works to develop strong business relationships both domestically and internationally. And we seek to encourage trade and business between Utah and other states and the world. And we seek business that's fair, sustainable, humane, and mutually benefits all of our citizens. Now, we're especially grateful for our strong ties with the people and the culture and the businesses of Japan. We deeply respect and admire the people and country of Japan. We in Utah want to encourage and grow those relationships. We recognize the strategic ties that make us business and trade partners. And we recognize the vital ties that make us military allies. Now, together, we're facing huge crises with North Korea and China. Together, we can face and overcome these crises, but we need each other to do so. I'm grateful to be here and work together with you, and together we will succeed. Thank you very much. Now, it is my great pleasure to turn the mic over to Representative Monica Stonier from the great state of Washington.
Thank you, Dr. Shiwazawa. First, Dr. Chano, thank you for your kind condolences. We will all take that message home for healing. And it may be a time where our laws and our identity as a country are getting in the way of the policy changes we need to make for our future. Thank you so much for the warm hospitality and for welcoming me to Japan, all of us to Japan. I represent the 49th Legislative District in Washington State. My district includes the western side of the city of Vancouver, not to be confused with Vancouver in British Columbia. It's America's Vancouver. I was born at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and I went to Western Washington University where I got my teaching certificate and a degree in psychology. After working as a teacher and getting married, starting my family with my best champion, my husband Brandon, I went back to school to get my master's degree in education at Washington State University in Vancouver. We have a part-time legislature in Washington because we value the concept that any citizen can serve as a lawmaker. While this may not always be the reality, we maintain this idea as this concept as our ideal. I'm not only proud to represent Japanese American and Latino American communities, but I'm also very proud to represent the working mothers in our policy making. My husband Brandon and I have 2 children of our own, Mallory and Zachary. They were 4 and 6 years old when I first ran for office and now are 12 and 14. Professionally, I work in our public schools in Vancouver as an instructional coach, training and supporting our teachers and principals in research-based practices. I've been a teacher and a coach for 17 years in a middle school with students between the ages of 12 and 15 and all levels of academic ability and achievement. Several years ago, I became incredibly frustrated that our state was passing laws that had a negative impact on our students and teachers because there were no practicing educators serving in the legislature. I decided I would make it my mission to bring an educator's perspective to the policy that was being passed and to better serve our educators and students in Washington State. As a proud Yonsei, Japanese American, it is my honor to be spending my first time here in Japan with you and to be traveling as a member of the Asian American Leadership Delegation of 2017. As a descendant of my Japanese family, I am one of 5 Asian American legislators in Washington State. In addition, I am also Mexican American, serving as one of 3 Latino legislators. I'm proud to represent my rich family cultures and communities of color, which is sometimes rare in my community. My great-grandfather Takasugi was born in 1893 and came to America from Japan when he was 14. He married my great-grandmother Tono by a traditional photograph marriage, and when she traveled to join him in California, they eventually had 11 children. My rich family history includes my 4 great-uncles who were in the 442nd Regimental Infantry, known as the Go for Broke Infantry. They're regarded as the most highly decorated infantry in U.S. military history. I recognize how fortunate I was to have known my great-grandparents, my aunts, and my uncles so well as a child. And now as a legislator, I serve on the Healthcare and Wellness Committee, which is an incredibly important one to my community because my region is the first area of the state to adopt some healthcare reforms that will integrate behavioral and mental health with physical health care, and the rest of my state will follow. I'm vice chair of the Education Committee, where I rely heavily on my experience and passion for our public schools. And I also serve on the Rules Committee and Capital Budget, where we fund our infrastructure projects, including school construction. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story with you. My state's capital, Olympia, is the sister city to Keito in Hyogo, Japan. I had the pleasure of hosting your delegation a couple years ago in Washington, and I look forward to learning more from you so that I may continue to foster this long-lasting relationship between Japan and my state. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the good gentleman from California, Representative Ponte.
Thank you. Turning it on is very important. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Bonta. I serve in the California State Assembly, and I'm extremely pleased to be here with you tonight. I just want to first thank the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the U.S. Japan Council for creating this opportunity for me to be here with you and having this once-in-a-lifetime experience. The core of the district that I represent is the city of Oakland, which is across the bay from San Francisco and the home to the world champions of basketball, the Golden State Warriors. I am the first Filipino-American state legislator in the history of California, and I'm the son of an immigrant from the Philippines, and I too was born in the Philippines in Quezon City, in Metro Manila. I came to the United States as a baby. Political activism and service run very deep in my family. My father marched in Selma, Alabama, and stood with Martin Luther King Jr. as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. My mother was an outspoken political dissident who protested the crackdown on freedoms under the regime of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. We were living there at the time, and it wasn't safe for us to stay. So we fled and rebuilt our lives in California, where we settled. I spent my early childhood in a magical place called La Paz, which is the headquarters of the United Farm Workers of America. My family and I grew up living in a trailer a few hundred yards away from the home of the iconic Cesar Chavez. I grew up watching my parents fight for human rights by organizing Filipino and Mexican-American farm workers, and feel extremely privileged that I was able to experience firsthand one of the greatest peaceful social, racial, and economic justice movements of all time. My parents worked directly with UFW co-founders Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who also were working side by side with great Filipino leaders like Philip Vera Cruz and Pete Velasco. And they taught me at a young age the importance of collaboration and working together for a common goal to achieve the outcomes that you strive for. My parents believed deeply in the power of education to transform one's life, and so while raising me in California, they sent my brother and my sister and I to the best public schools that they could, and always pushed us to dream of going to college. I had that dream, and with the help of financial aid and cleaning laundry rooms to help pay for it, I was able to have a very strong higher education, including college and law school in Connecticut and graduate school in England. After working as an attorney, I decided to run for office because I wanted to have a seat at the table where decisions were made and be a voice for those who have not historically been heard. I was first elected to local positions before serving in the Capitol in California, and I never believed as a small child that one day I might be the first Filipino legislator in the history of California in 160 years plus, especially since Filipinos now comprise the largest and fastest growing Asian American group in the state. As such, I feel compelled to be a voice for them and to fight for our community. And one of the first bills I ever introduced was a bill that required that the contributions of Filipino Americans to the California farm labor movement, something that I experienced but was not being told in our history books, be told and taught in our public schools, and that is now law. As an elected official, I'm driven by progressive values of justice and inclusion and equity and opportunity, and feel very blessed to serve in a great state like California, which is pushing the envelope on so many things, from climate change to healthcare to standing up for our immigrants. It's truly an honor to have this opportunity to visit Japan and visit with governmental and business leaders and experience the country and the culture. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I look forward to our dialogue. And I have the pleasure of introducing State Representative Erin Ling Johansen from the great state of Hawaii.
Good afternoon and aloha, everyone. I'm a fourth-generation Asian American of Japanese, Chinese, and Caucasian descent. My ancestors immigrated from Okinawa to Hawaii before 1900 to work on Hawaii's sugar plantations. My grandmother, who I grew up with, was the eldest daughter and the third of 10 children born to Taro and Ushi Shiroma. My grandmother was a trailblazer. She was the first in the family to marry outside her race when she married my Chinese grandfather, who was a Pearl Harbor shipfitter in 1932. Although Hawaii has become a modern-day ethnic melting pot, interracial marriage was very rare in the 1930s. Although neither grandparent had beyond a middle school education, they worked hard, and thanks to their sacrifice and America's public education system, my family went from the plantation to America's Ivy League in 3 generations. My grandparents' and parents' sacrifice enabled me to graduate from Yale University. In this respect, like many of my colleagues, our family has truly lived the American dream, immigrating to America, receiving an education, and making a better life for one's family. Originally, I had thought the best way to give back was to serve the public in the executive branch. Consequently, I moved to Washington, D.C. and served as a division director in the White House in the Office of Presidential Personnel. In this capacity, for 2 years, I recruited, interviewed, vetted, and ultimately recommended individuals for federal U.S. Senate-confirmed senior leadership positions to the President of the United States. Additionally, I also served as Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Mint, helping to advise the director of a $2 billion federal agency responsible for manufacturing all of America's circulating coinage and collectible coins. In my 4 years in Washington, D.C., I started to realize that the early framers of America's Constitution and governmental structure placed the greatest power and the ability to affect the lives of our people in the legislative branch, not necessarily in the executive branch. I was constantly frustrated by legislative mandates and dictates that I felt were rooted in bad policy or impossible to implement and unrealistic. Perhaps it was time to consider working in the executive branch, and perhaps it was time for a change. After returning home to Hawaii, I ran for state representative and was elected at the age of 30. At 32, I became the youngest minority leader in the Hawaii State House of Representatives history at that point. But as in life, many things change, as in politics, many things change. And at the age of 34, I felt like the Republican Party no longer best represented my values. I left the Republican Party and became a member of the Democratic Party. It's been 3 years since, and I now occupy the leadership position in the Hawaii State House of Representatives of Majority Whip, as well as chair of the Labor Committee. I really want to take this time to say a big thank you and a big mahalo to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, as well as the U.S. Japan Council for having us here today, and for all of you for being here today. We really look forward to our continuing dialogue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing with us your personal histories, what moving stories you'll have. Your stories were really about what makes America, I thought. And in the pictures, I was amazed. You all have the same smiles in your family. So there must be some sort of a strong genes in your family, the smiling gene. And I understand that for some of you, it's the first time visit to Japan. So to begin our conversation, I wonder if you could very briefly, in about a minute or so, share with us what would be the takeaways from your visit this time. And can I start again in the same order?
It's great to be the first one, and you get to go really fast, so now I'll take my time. Well, thank you, everyone. It is absolutely wonderful to see all of you, and thank you for taking your time to come in and meet with us today. My first impression of visiting Japan for my very first time, it is absolutely fulfilling my childhood dream of what Japan had always been, and this is what I've heard even when I was in Cambodia as a young boy and all the way living in America, and you hear so much and you've seen so much that Japan is definitely a world leader in businesses, and of course the culture and the respect that I felt since arriving here. There's so much that I have seen and loved every minute of it and still continue to do so. I hope to take many back of all this amazing experience back to my hometown of Massachusetts. Thank you.
So this is my first time in Japan as well. I come from Maryland, which is very close to DC, and we have a very multicultural sense there. But on the other hand, not having ever been to Japan, it's certainly just created such a strong impression of such a wonderful nation. Really the sense of beauty and of serenity. To travel from here to Kyoto, it's been a wonderful journey to be able to see at least some parts of the country throughout our time here. You know, I am just so impressed by the civility and respect of the Japanese people that all of you have for each other. And really, as someone who comes from a country where we do, because of our history, value rugged individualism and kind of really that individualistic sense, I certainly see the tremendous value in the Japanese society in its identity as being part of a broader society. And I think there's a lot that we can also learn from that as well. So it's a real pleasure to be here and experience so much that is wonderful about the Japanese culture.
I've been the tourist here a time or two in the past, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that. But this is my first time here in a sort of official capacity. And so a couple impressions. On the surface, what a beautiful, wonderful, clean country. I feel safer here than I felt in San Francisco. And so that's wonderful here. And then as a people, I'm impressed with the discipline and also coupled with innovation that we see in the businesses and in the various groups here. We visit the large groups and small groups and businesses, and the forward look of the great businesses that will guarantee not only the future of Japan, but also really our partnership with Japan as we go forward. So this has been wonderful. It's been enlightening, and it's really an honor to be here. So thank you.
And Monica, you had your birthday here, no?
I did, yes, today.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. I guess what I would like to share is just how comforting it feels to be in a country that looks like my great-grandparents' garden. There was a beautiful garden I grew up in as a child, and a koi fish pond with a pagoda, and to walk in a country that looks just like the garden I loved as a child and would escape to when visiting. It feels very comforting and very much at home here. So I'll happily report that to my mother, who's hoping that that's how I will find it. I would just also add that I'm really hoping that, you probably saw in the photo, my husband is Caucasian, and my children don't look like the child of a Mexican American or a Japanese American. But it's incredibly important to me that they know where they come from. So I look forward to bringing my children, my family here in the very near future, maybe to celebrate someone else's birthday since I'm here on mine. So thank you for the warm welcome.
One of the things I noticed was the focus on collective well-being and group success. And that's not something that is always emphasized in the United States, certainly not nearly enough. And it takes a lot of forms. Certainly one of the starkest contrasts was Japan's approach to guns, and recognizing that at a time when we went through the worst gun massacre in the history of the United States with what happened in Las Vegas. Also, the transportation systems and the well-planned urban areas, the cleanliness, they all scream, we need to live together and be successful together. And so that really stood out. And then when we met with the business leaders, they would often lead with their commitment to addressing social problems and their social responsibility to literally address and take on the biggest problems facing the country and the world. So that all stood out to me and really moved me and impacted me. I also noticed the beautiful blending of a celebration of history and retention of history on the one hand, while also moving bravely into the future and the modern age. So it's been wonderful to see that as well.
This is not my first time in Japan, but this is my first time as someone who's been responsible for the lives of others in governing. The other times that I lived here were both as a high school exchange student and a college exchange student, and it's really been impressed upon me through our many meetings with various business leaders and various governmental officials. It's sort of this new realization, because I'm looking at Japan maybe through adult eyes, of how amazing Japan's modern story is to go from post-World War II to a global economic power, not just so quickly, but so effectively in a way that's had a lasting, meaningful impact for all of Japanese society. And as someone who now has to govern, I realize how difficult that is, but what a wonderful job Japan has done.
Well, thank you for sharing with us your insights and impressions during your visit to Japan. And one question that I wanted to ask is related to the American dream that many of you mentioned in your presentation, and also the sense of mission that compelled you to run for office and to serve the community and your country. But I already have some of the questions from the floor, and some of in the audience have also wanting to ask the question related to the recent events in the U.S., like the white supremacy incident in Charlottesville, or the Trump administration's decision regarding Daca, the deferred action for childhood arrivals, and the possible limitations to the measure that had allowed immigrants who entered as minors to receive a period of deferred action from deportation. And those incidents have somewhat puzzled us here. Do you think it is still the same America and its community that respects and embrace diversity? What are your views? May I start by asking Rob? You said that you were driven by strong, progressive values of justice, inclusion, equity, and opportunity. Do you think the recent development perhaps point to a different direction?
I am glad you were surprised and shocked here in Japan, because I think that's the appropriate response to those, to the incident in Charlottesville and the tragedy of Charlottesville, as well as the decision on Daca. I think we're continuing to move forward, but advancement and progress sometimes moves in zigs and zags. It's not linear. It's not always straight. Sometimes you have a setback, sometimes you move laterally, sometimes you may even move backwards. And that's happening now. These are, we're not moving with the same aggression that we did prior to, frankly, the new administration and the new president. And I think he has a lot to do with it. The powers of the president are very important, so is the bully pulpit, and what you say and the values you promote. And I think right now that this president is giving permission for people who are all complicated and full of beautiful characteristics and not so beautiful ones, to tap into some of the not so beautiful ones. And that came out in Charlottesville, and that is certainly not who we are. Those incidents are part of our history, but it's not who we've become. And many folks across the nation have taken strong stances against the hate and the violence and the exclusion, and for inclusion and unity and love and peace, and that's the right response. As for Daca, I really believe that was a cruel and heartless and morally bankrupt decision by Mr. Trump. These are young people who came to this country with parents who were seeking a better life and opportunity, often fleeing danger, and who had absolutely no choice and no say in that matter. And since they've come, they've gone to college and grad school, they've started businesses, they've owned homes, they've served in the military, they've paid taxes. They're American in every way except for on paper. And they don't deserve to be treated like that. And that's something that we feel very strongly about in California, with the largest number of immigrants and undocumented Californians, and DACA Californians.
Thank you. Aaron, you were nodding as you listened to Rob speak. What are your views regarding this? We often talk about the American dream and the dreamers, but are we seeing a situation where the so-called dreamers may not end up being dreamers?
I think it's important to look at politics not just for the short-term events, but through a long-term lens. And I think long-term you see what America's values are, but I think one of the things that America is constantly having to work out in its modern experiment of what it means to be sort of an idea and a country that's not based on a particular race or a particular language or a long-standing history is that it's this constantly evolving experiment of trying to get to, I think, its truest sense of identity. So most Americans would express the same sentiments as Rob, but I think people would also recognize that there's progress that needs to be made in our country. And when you look at this stage three of us are mixed races, and more America is moving in that direction just because the Asian and Hispanic populations are growing at such rapid rates. And there's a lot of sharing and celebration of diversity, but there's also a lot of melding that goes on in America. And I think with respect to immigrants, there are many of us that recognize that they're just future Americans in the same way that we were once immigrants in our homeland. So I think there's a bright future for anyone wishing to come to America and to be American, but America doesn't always get everything right all the time, and I think we're having to struggle through a difficult time, but we will ultimately come out the better for it, and it'll be a more inclusive, embracing society when we work it out.
Okay. There was one, if I could ask you a follow-up question, a question from the floor, asking, do you think the racial divide is accelerating in the United States? What would be your response to that?
I think it's getting a lot of attention. I don't know that it's accelerating. Unfortunately, the American media likes to cover the most controversial of things, not necessarily the everyday goings-on. So many of our headlines are extrapolating sometimes. It makes it look like things are happening in greater frequency or a bigger scope than they always are. Again, I think there are problems that need to be realistically confronted, but I think most Americans believe in a harmonious, celebrating diversity sort of country.
Right, so it goes back to your comment about the long-term, the values aspect of things, and the need to keep that in mind.
Right. I mean, we've moved past, I mean, the 1960s was a big period for civil rights in America, and we had a lot of advances, but, clearly it didn't perfect everything. And so, it's a constantly ongoing process to try to, I think, get to the truest sense of our American values.
And Roddy, you spoke about the American dream also, and you spoke about it very passionately. Do you feel that that is something that may not be taken for granted?
Well, you have to understand that this is a child who lived through war-torn Cambodia, and this is right in front of my eyes. So I'm an outsider. I'm not a first generation. And some way, somehow, we were so fortunate that my parents decided to give their children a second chance at life. And the hope that they had was to come to America. Now, it's not something where you can just roll a dice and says, we're going to get there and everything will be grand. When you go through and walk through the landmine, the reason why you go through the landmine because one had blown up already, so you go that direction, it's cleared up. That's what I've seen, that's what I experienced in my lifetime. Now, to live in America, it's still that dream, and here's why. America is still very young. We don't have fixed boxes where you belong to, but it takes individual to change our thoughts and the way that we think. And that's what makes America what it is from beginning to now. And if you look at all of the culture around the world, and of course one would be Japan and what have you, you've gone through all that tough time, and finally you have put together the best society that you can believe on, whether that is business, and of course creating that into society. For me, yes, we do have all the difficulty in America, but I believe that in the news media, when you only focus on the negativities, nothing really grows positively from a negative that you talk over and over and over. But if you talk about the positivities, it translates in so many ways. That's why I choose to talk about the positivity. And when I shared my story, I encourage others being the first from Cambodia to be elected and going back to Cambodia, I inspire millions of people to realize that it is possible. And the only thing I tell them, these are the students I made, I tell them that your thoughts unveil exactly what you want in life, out of life. I learned that in America and gave me that opportunity to think positively, that I can do that. And the worst of all is that when you don't think positively, that's where we have problem. And when you put an idea that I'm going to change something, you follow through with it, it will work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for reminding us of the important role that media plays. And I think you have a point well made, because media can blow things out of the proportion if we're not careful. If I can go on to Brian, I think you have been in the politics longest amongst the group. And how do you see the state of America today? Now, there are questions from the floor also regarding Daca, as well as the gun control. How are you seeing the situation?
Well, some things never change. When you talk, for example, about the American dream, what is the American dream? The American dream is basically that if you come to the United States, man or woman, and you work hard, maybe have a little bit of a break, that you can succeed, raise your family, and create a business. And we see that, whether you're a founder of Google or you're a Japanese-American farmer in southern Idaho. But there is that possibility, there's that hope and that promise. But, you know, we had internment camps in World War II where American citizens of Japanese ancestry were put in internment camps 1 generation ago. And what was the reason? Well, the ostensible reason was for national security, right? Protection against a perceived threat. Well, that's the same exact logic that's being used today in terms of looking at immigrants and ignoring the value of immigration and the talents and the great things that an immigrant can bring to this country, to the great country. And after all, America is just that. It's a land of immigrants. And so to ignore the value of an immigrant and the immigration that we have, I think is really short-sighted and really goes against the great promise that we have in our country. And frankly, ought to be here as well. You know, we have some real challenges when you look at where we go forward. We don't have enough young people in either country. We don't have enough to carry on our own businesses, sustainability. We can't even staff our own businesses when we come up with some great ideas. We don't have enough young people to do so. Where's that support for the people now going to come from? Anyway, so I think unfortunately history repeats itself, and we do have to learn, or we're going to keep repeating these same doggone problems again and again.
So do you think it is a challenge to try and build the unity? In other words, as some of the questions indicate, do you think there's a stark division between the camps?
Well, by that, I'm wondering if you're referring to, say, maybe the Trump administration, the other administration. There is definitely a different way of looking at the immigrant problem. Let's just take that for an example. There is clearly a difference there. The U.S. Chamber has figured it out long ago that we need immigration and we need legal paths for immigration for both adults and children. Because why? Because without that, America does not grow. And we heard from the American Chamber of Commerce here in Japan the same thing this morning, that they recognize the need for this. So yes, there is. There's a difference. But you know, what we ought to do is the right thing. And it ought not be a Republican or a Democrat issue. It ought to be what's the right thing for the countries. And if that happens to be using common sense to go forward, then that ought to be the driving force in our policy. And ma'am, that's not what we have right now. If you look at the United States, we are probably more gridlocked in our Congress and less effective than I can remember in decades. And without that, we are not going to make any progress, and we're going to stay down that same road, whether it's healthcare or immigration or any other important idea. until we figure out that way to cross the aisle, to talk intelligent like you're doing up in Washington State, and do those sorts of things that will make some sense. So thank you.
Thank you. What about you, Monica?
Well, I guess, my perspective is one who goes through active shooter drills in public schools. So, there's what we experience day to day and prepare our children for at such a young age is hard to accept. Additionally, after the announcement of the repeal of Daca, there were students crying in the lunch line at their young age. Their biggest sadness was that they were scared they weren't going to see their friends, the other kids, the next day at school. Of course, parents had other fears and worries, but that's a pretty tangible vision, thinking of a lunch line like that. So, I really kind of try to view things through the lens of kids that I work with. Knocking on doors and running a campaign as a Hispanic in a very conservative county offered me some opportunities to hear messages left on my machine afterwards. And, I encountered, racism and conflict growing up. But I was surprised at how it hit me when it was so directed right at me and my family and left on an answering machine. So I've not been kind of unaware of that sentiment. I think what's happened in the last year is that sentiment that has always been there has been given a microphone, has been given a megaphone. So it's not that we've lived without, we've been fighting. You've heard stories of, fighting injustices for a long time. That's not something that is too far away in our history that we don't remember. I just think that the things we've been fighting against have been latent and quiet. And maybe if you give an opportunity for somebody to leave a message on your answering machine, you might experience a little bit more than everybody else. But people generally knew better than to say awful things in the grocery store line, or to yell something out their window, or to spray paint something on somebody's car or garage. I think what's happened recently is now we have rallies and websites and events that are centered around this hatred. And so we've given that a microphone in our country. But I think the hopeful side of that is that we now have another opportunity for our children who are learning to work with each other and see each other as humans and recognizing that they have a whole lot more in common than they have that divides them, to define what their next generation is going to look like. We have fewer concerns among young people about interracial marriage or transgender, gay, lesbian rights and marriage equality. Those are things, children start to see each other as humans when we allow them to. And I think that we're going to see a stronger next generation as a result of these hard times now. Our history is very short in the United States. So we've kind of, I think of a really poorly built roller coaster at a county fair. It's very jolting. It hasn't been built long enough to have smooth rides. And I think that's what we're experiencing when we grow in a country with such a short history. It's much more jolting.
Earlier in at the very beginning of your presentation, Monica, you mentioned the recent incident in Las Vegas. Any comment regarding the gun control? There was some questions regarding that issue also.
Well, trying to anticipate what the questions were from the audience, I suspect they're the same questions we have up here as well. I think that we've talked about it a little bit. Since the shooting, we've had many questions about our gun policies in the country, often brought up in all the different meetings we've had. And I think the hope that I have is that you would understand that we are failing to recognize that we can do something about this right now. we have this belief in the United States that everybody should have the right to bear arms, and I don't think anybody really disagrees with that. I think we just have to be smarter about who has them and what for, and what capacity they have. There's definitely a place in our nation's policy to do what Japan has done, to take what is old and part of our history and a part of our identity and change it so that it doesn't, so that it changes with the times. And we're failing to do that right now. And I don't have good answers for that. I've shared before that it's not a party lines issue either. It largely falls along those lines, but in my state, we as Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion, and still were not able to pass background checks in Washington state. So it doesn't necessarily fall along party lines as some think it does.
Thank you. And Clarence, what are your views?
Sure. So I think it's a very important question. I think it brings to mind that the U.S. it's never a perfect nation, right? We were founded as an imperfect nation. Even built into our Constitution were references and permissions for slavery to occur. We recognize that democracy is messy. It's a process. It's a process that can take a while. It's a process that requires us to all have some degree of patience. But I think to your question about the American dream, our American dream is that we understand that we can always continue to improve ourselves as a nation. And we're seeing a lot of challenges here in our country, many of which you've alluded to earlier, particularly when it comes to income inequality. We're seeing huge disparities there in economic injustice and also social irresponsibility from many different areas within our society. And where that manifests itself are in some of the policies that many of you had cited earlier, whether it comes to guns or DACA, healthcare reform, Charlottesville, the foreign policy. We see a lot of challenges when it comes to those types of policies and what is taking place in our country now. I think you should bear in mind that the country is not uniform in its views. That when some of these more controversial policies were announced, that there were protests, and that's really the right of free speech to many in our country to be able to protest either for or against policies that we feel strongly about. And so that's also ingrained in the American body and American history as an American right, that we go through these types of struggles together, but in the end come out better for it. But it's a challenging period of change, and that's the type of change that you're seeing now, and have a front seat in history to the changes that we're seeing in America. And so to those of you who look at the U.S. and see some of our policies maybe in aghast or in horror, I ask you to be patient and to bear with us, because as I mentioned, democracy is a messy sport. And for many folks, there is disagreement over the types of federal policies that we're seeing coming forth. Many of the types of policies that you had voiced concerns about, I think it's important to bear in mind, even from the election, as controversial and as challenging as the election was, that the opponent of our current president actually in the end ended up with more votes than the current president. It's the way that our system is set up, that President Trump was elected as president, and he has every right to serve in that capacity. But, I think it is important to bear in mind that I don't think a majority of the people necessarily agree with all the views that you're seeing coming out of the federal government right now. And so I ask of you to be patient and continue to have hope, because the arc of history does bend towards justice. It's just sometimes nonlinear, as we're seeing now.
Clarence, if I could ask you a follow-up question. You spoke about democracy being messy, and that there can be some sort of pushback forces within the community. Would I be right in saying that when there's so much change in the society and the community, rather than just reacting to the changes, there can be opportunities and perhaps responsibility also to try and take a more proactive role as the constituent, like the members of the community, to try and influence the course of certain policies? Related to what Rob was saying earlier, I think. What are your views?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, democracy is messy, but we are reliant on hearing from our constituents, on understanding some of their views, and trying to do the best, all of us, in representing our constituents. Our constituents don't all agree, and that's why you see a difference of perspectives here, and that's healthy, I think. You know, as I mentioned, some of the biggest challenges that I see in my district are income inequality. I represent a district that has probably the highest per capita educated, so number of graduate degrees of any county in the country. But I also represent parts of another county where many families are struggling. These were formerly blue-collar families that had well-paying jobs, and now these days are seeing many of their jobs go overseas or earning wages that no longer are able to sustain their own families. And so, you know, we see a lot of those types of challenges in America, and I think that's leading to a lot of the upheaval that we're seeing within our political system now. I think we will work through it. I think, you know, we, in times of crisis and challenge, do come together as an American society to find a way forward. But it can be tumultuous along the way and generate a lot of unease. But, you know, we have always come together as an American people. There is certainly a sense of American spirit to fulfill the American dream, and I think that's where I ask of you to have hope and be patient and bear with us.
Well, thank you, Clarence. There were actually two more questions that I wanted to ask each and every panelist, but they are very good questions from the floor as well. So I will first explain to you what my questions were, and as I introduce those questions from the floor, I would very much appreciate it if you could sort of keep my questions in mind also in addressing those questions. And my questions were, I was in Washington, D.C. earlier last month, and some in the Senate and Congress told me that in the U.S. it is most often the state senators and the state representatives who are more in tune with what's happening, because they work closely with the community and the people and hear their voices. So I was wanting to ask you what voices you are hearing in your community and what do voices tell you. And my next question was, because you work at the state level, what difference do you think you can make in your community and in your country towards shaping the course of your country? So that was initially the questions that I wanted to ask you. And please keep that in mind as you address these questions I have from the floor. One is from a professor at Keio University regarding TPP to any panelists. The US withdrawal from the TPP, to what extent did the state legislatures debate on the TPP during the negotiations? So hands up, please, if you can provide us with your insights. Any discussions or any comments regarding the course of TPP? Please, Rob.
TPP was a much debated and discussed issue during the presidential election. And so that's how it came to many of us. It was something, of course, that President Obama's administration helped put together and work out and spent countless hours preparing and negotiating, and then something that, in the end, during the presidential election, all the major candidates opposed it. And mostly because, I won't say all, Senator Sanders from Vermont, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump, obviously the eventual winner. And so it was like the candidates, the nominees on both sides were agreeing that it wasn't the right approach, and the biggest concern was about the impact on American jobs. And so it took on a life of its own, that in a political sense, that it almost became a third rail. and impossible to support. And once commitments were made, certainly they had to be at least attempted to follow through on, and Mr. Trump has followed through on it. So is that the end of TPP forever and the United States' participation in it? No. We live in politics and public service in windows of political opportunity, and sometimes they're open and sometimes they're closed. TPP was open for a while. If it didn't get into the catch the snag of the presidential election in the United States of America, it may have and was resolved earlier and got to the Congress for final ratification. It may be that the United States would be a participant today. But that wasn't the case, and I think ongoing work will have to be done. And I think to the extent that amendments and tweaks are made regarding the U.S.'s potential future participation, I think there needs to really be attention to this idea of threat to American jobs. And look, it could be anything. I mean, it could be facts showing that that it's a myth and that that's not going to happen. It could be assurances about retraining for those who might lose their job but would have an opportunity to have a job in another area. So, those are sort of my reflections on TPP, mostly that it took on a political life that was larger than the policy itself that was doomed for failure for the United States' participation. But there's always tomorrow, maybe not a tomorrow with Mr. Trump, but potentially a tomorrow with another president.
What are your views, Brian?
Well, I'll speak as the only Republican in this group. I think it's very significant that the first major foreign minister or leader that Donald Trump entertained in Washington, D.C. was who? It was the Prime Minister Abe. Now, keep that in perspective. The perception of job loss is probably one of the biggest drivers between the failure of the TPP. And that's the same thing as NAFTA, right? I mean, the failure of American jobs, and one of the big promises Donald Trump made to the American populace and the voters that may have swung some swing states was what? I'm going to bring jobs back that we've lost before, the jobs that we've lost overseas. So that's the perception. So just take that into consideration. We have had, meaning Japan and the United States, a strong, enduring trade partnership for decades. And we will always bicker over, like two families do, over what's absolutely perfect or what's absolutely right for each country. But bear in mind, Donald Trump's next big visit is where? It's going to be to the Far East. And so I think you'll see an evolution, at least I see, hopefully, education and an evolution on the attitudes with this trade agreement, because after all, right now, this is a crucial time. One of the big things we need to do is to make sure our trade partnerships are intact and our military alliances are intact, because frankly, the biggest allies that the United States has in this world, in this part of the area, is Japan and South Korea. So I'm watching with real interest to see where this is going to go. And I think you'll have a president who's first and foremost a businessman and who recognizes the value of business partners and good, strong business partners.
Thank you, Brian. And there's a question for you, Clarence, about Obamacare. As a medical doctor, how does the current debate about whether to repeal Obamacare affect you? The question goes.
So, I think in America there's a fundamental question that divides, our electorate there, which is whether health care is a right or if health care is a privilege. I think you as a society have decided that health care really is a right for everyone. But we're still having that ongoing debate. There are folks who believe that you should have to pay in or make some significant contribution of some sort to be able to have, the stability of health care. It's a really challenging issue for the U.S. It's steeped in a lot of history. Nobody would design the healthcare system that we currently have in the U.S. It's been built on years and years of how healthcare has been, provided, and tax credits that have been provided to businesses to incentivize them to provide healthcare to their employees. In many ways, it's a conundrum because if you would think about it, healthcare for many folks are actually tied to their employer. And so when people lose employment, they actually lose health insurance, which is probably at the time when they actually need that coverage to make sure that they do stay healthy and can continue to join the workforce. And so there are a lot of inherent challenges to our healthcare system. We are spending much more than any other industrialized nation on healthcare, and our outcomes are poorer. We have challenges with price gouging of drugs, of rising pharmaceutical costs, of an aging population that's spending quite a bit at the end of life, and many challenges when it comes to health insurance, both for-profit health insurance and non-profit insurance that's there. There are no easy solutions. I think, from my perspective, as a physician, as a Democrat, I do support the Affordable Care Act, and I'm glad to see that the repeal efforts were not successful. I think it would have been very accurate, and what you saw from the estimates from the Congressional Budget Office and so many others, that millions and millions of people would have lost health insurance had the repeal taken place. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from other nations as well, but it's a very challenging issue because healthcare in the U.S. is built on a lot of history, of which many of it doesn't make sense as to how you would design a current healthcare system.
Thank you, Clarence. And there's a question to you, Monica, because diversity is not just about race and ethnicity, but also about gender. And the question goes regarding women's empowerment as a working mother. Japan has implemented various measures. What are some of ideas or recommendations to continue to promote this in terms of policy?
I think there's a balance, or not even a balance, but there needs to be an addition to the efforts in policy. My state just passed paid family leave, paid family sick leave. So if you have a baby or adopt a new family member, somebody gets sick, you can have up some of your salary until you return. And so that's the first big step I think that we have made in our country, is start moving towards some policies and budget backups that provide some support and coverage for a family-friendly work environment. We have been talking in my Capitol building, now that we have more and more legislators with small families, small children in their families. A lot of people have small families, but they're just older children. The parents that come with small children are talking about how we need to consider having childcare available for legislators who are serving. Last year, my dear friend was nursing a new baby on the side of the floor. So it was a matter of trying to make workplaces more compatible with women in the workplace. We've seen a couple articles recently about that talk about corporations, businesses, and state agencies, actually, in my state, that have baby-friendly work environments where there are nursing rooms, and women who can multitask and get their work done at work can bring their babies and have them strapped to them at standing desks. And when that gets to be a problem, they can go home and care for their child and then work remotely for the rest of the day. And their work time is flexible, not on the clock. It's flexible over the day or the week, or it's project-based. So I think we're starting to see some different innovations in what work means and what workspace looks like. But I think in addition to policies, we need to talk more about what we want to see reflected in our society. So I'm fortunate to have a husband who I don't know about fortunate, it was kind of my plan to marry somebody who would very much share in the child care and rearing of our children. So when I got my master's degree, my daughter was 6 months old. That's several nights I was gone to school, and he was doing bath time and feeding. And she's been very connected to him all of her life. And so when you have a partnership like that is raising kids together, and one moves in and out, it's less of an impact. So the men who serve in the legislature with very small children have a different relationship with their kids if they haven't shared in that child-rearing experience. And I think that, so there's what we talk about in terms of roles of a man and a woman and gender roles in our communities and in our families needs to happen across generations. We need to understand that I'm not going to face criticism from my grandmother or from the older neighbor up at the street about who told me that I should, he said, well, I don't know why you're running for office. You should be home with your children. And I was like, well, there aren't any mothers with children in the legislature, that's why. And so, you know, thinking about what would the reaction be from different people, we need to start shaping those conversations on a social level and a neighbor to neighbor and a family level, generation to generation. So that's less of an impact. We can change policies, but if perceptions aren't shifting with it, we don't get very far fast enough. So.
And I think the next question is also addressed to you, Monica, regarding being a part-time legislators. What is the advantage and disadvantage of the part-time legislators? Do you recommend the system to other states and countries?
I think I love the ideal that anybody can participate in government. That's the goal. It doesn't always work that way, and we're working on that, as I said in my introduction. I don't know that I could make a recommendation to, I'm not one to tell others how they ought to operate. I do know that participating in a part-time legislature, that means that I have to work for somebody who is flexible to that. And it also means that I have to recognize that the time that my colleagues are spending learning about other areas in legislative policy is time that I'm spending at my job working. However, the work that I do in public schools and professional development and teaching is greatly needed in policy making. So there's a give and take, and I'm not sure, you know, what a part-time versus full-time legislature may fit at one state better than another. I'm not sure how that would work. I think it's important to take into consideration that each of our states are different. My constituency is not as large as Assemblyman Ponte's constituency, so there are definitely some differences. The challenge is making sure that everybody has access to the system. I think that is the ultimate bar for standard, and so long as you are breaking down those barriers, I think the legislature will be more effective.
So time is almost up, so I just want to ask you one last question, and I would appreciate if you could make it very brief. It's about whether you think, what difference you think you can make in your capacity as state legislators in shaping the course of your country. So may I start with Aaron, very briefly.
Sure, very briefly, Hawaii is a smaller economy compared to other states, but there are unique things that we can leverage, including our historically strong ties to Japan. And I'll just tell one anecdote. Many Diet members vacation in Hawaii, and they'll do a little bit of business, but you know, as I'm sure many of you have been to Hawaii as tourists. But Hawaii has been able to manage that into very mature relationships. And we were sitting at the Consul General's home one day, and just as a joke, Prime Minister Abe's wife was in Hawaii, but someone said to the Diet members, why isn't Prime Minister Abe here? He should have come here, not just his wife. Little did we know that it was Yoshida-sama and someone in his inner circle of 7 important counselors. He picked up his cell phone and called Prime Minister Abe, and Prime Minister Abe didn't answer, but called him back a minute later, and he said, I can't leave Hawaii until you come. If you fast forward a few months, I mean, it wasn't just this call, obviously, but when Prime Minister Abe and President Obama talked about world peace at Pearl Harbor, I mean, it was a very momentous moment. So I think as small as some of our states are, you have to look specifically at what your unique advantages are And sometimes there are ways to impact diplomacy for the positive. Thank you.
In California, there's a belief that we're really leading the resistance and the fight for the values that we've stood for so long, and will help assure continue to make progress. And in the face of Mr. Trump's election, the next day a number of leaders came together and wrote a letter to Californians, and it said something to the effect of, California wasn't part of this nation at its inception, but clearly we're the holder of its future. And we woke up feeling as if we were strangers in a foreign land after the election, and that we'll work our best to be a beacon of hope and a shining light to all who want to pursue the values that we've been fighting for. And we really have an opportunity to do that, given the stature that we have in our United States of America. We're the largest state in the nation. We're the most diverse. We are the 6th largest economy in the world. We're the state that led to the phrase in politics, as California goes, so goes the rest of the nation. So we really feel a personal responsibility to fight and defend, fight for and defend and stand up for our immigrants, to fight for health care for all Californians and people in the United States of America, to fight for civil rights, to continue to lead on addressing global climate change and saving our planet. And so I've always been proud to be a Californian, but now more than ever, given the juxtaposition between where the federal government appears to be headed and where we want to go.
I'll probably answer this by answering your earlier questions about whose voices I hear and what are they saying. I think that in order to have an impact as a leader in my state, I have to take into consideration the reasons I ran for office in the first place, and those were compelling reasons, and that's why people voted for me, and so I should maybe hold on to that for a little while. There aren't legislators or there aren't educators in our legislature, so I listen very closely to the needs of our education system and offer some leadership there. We have a housing crisis in my community. I have over 8,000 homeless children in my county. That is hard to accept. So we have big challenges in my community with regard to affordable housing. And those voices are very loud, and oftentimes those voices don't come from the people because they're struggling to survive, but the advocates. And so that partnership is important to maintain. And finally, I hear the voices in my email box and on the phone of people who really would like to go see a doctor and are not able to do that without going bankrupt. So, those are the voices that I hear on a policy level, but I also believe that I have a role as an advocate in my community, which means I stand firmly and loudly with our Daca students, our dreamers. I stand firmly and loudly with their parents who have every right to question why a country would all of a sudden decide that immigration should stop after they have found themselves comfortably in our country's walls. And so I feel like, I have an advocacy role and I have a policy role, but in order to be an effective leader in my state, I have to take into consideration what the voices are asking for.
We had a representative in Congress who served 3 terms from the state of Utah. Do you know how many bills he got passed during those 3 terms? He got 0 bills passed at the federal level. And right now, if you look at our at our Congress, we are so gridlocked with the impasse between the partisan right and the left that we're really not accomplishing much. The failure of Graham Cassidy bill on health care is a great example of that. There was no bipartisan look at that, Heiko, and as a result, we don't have a path forward in terms of a replace on health care, and so we will have the ACA, Obamacare, for the foreseeable future. So can state legislators make a difference? You bet they can. In fact, that might be the most effective way to make an impact. Let me just give you one example now. Pass this on. But for example, One of the first bills I passed was a bill to authorize our state to provide children with autism health insurance so they could get the treatment that they need. And what this will do is we'll take this group of kids with autism, and it's for some reason it's real prominent in Utah, and it will give them education and treatment and hopefully mainstream them into education and in society so they're not stuck in group homes or really have problems. Now, we're able to lead out on that, and that is an example to the rest of the country who looks at the treatment of autism. And now we started that in Utah, and we proved that it's effective, it's affordable, and it's changed the lives of kids. And it was unfortunately not something that we could do at a federal level. So yes, the answer is, I think, clear and unequivocally, especially now with the Congress we have, that the best way forward may be at the state level.
So, with the question about, what can states do and how can states function differently, in the United States, states do function very differently than prefectures here in Japan, and they're given some degree of sovereignty to decide on their own laws. Many states, because of federal policies that have come forth, have decided to sue the federal government. Some have set up their own policies, as Rob was mentioning, that are directly in opposition to the federal government. But when you look back at the history of the United States, you also recognize that states are places for experimentation, and I think we'll continue to see that over the next few years. And then also bear in mind that states are, that there are certain powers that are expressly granted to the states. So areas like law enforcement, that's purely a state function. Areas like public health and transportation, a lot of intrastate infrastructure, higher education and public schools, growth and planning, all of those functions are state functions. And so there is a lot of means for states to continue to push forward with progressive policies, with policies that line up with their own constituents. And so I think we'll continue to see a lot of innovative work being done by states that hopefully will be taken up more broadly in the future. Thank you.
How nice when you have the entire panel answer everything already. Well, I have to say that the one thing that really brings to light, especially in my hometown, again, all politics in America, we say, is all local. And this is what is so crucial. And the democracy works when you step out and vote. And so one particular incident was that here's a group that is in my town, or my city, of Lowell, and they asked to have this particular road and bridge rebuilt. Well, of course, it never took place. A long story short, I told the group that came to me, I said, listen, if you get your entire group together, we can make this happen. Did you know that within the past 30 years, nothing will happen, yet I'm in office for 6 months, the road was paved. So that's a great example of what is an effective leadership that listen. And I believe that as a public servant, you have to listen, you have to be the voice. And that is different for me. I'm very transparent in the sense that I do go to meet my constituent. I do go to talk to them, so much so that the guys who of course, my first year or so, I'm so busy learning the job, then finally I had time to go back to meet with them and talk with them. They were shocked. They said, well, why are you here? I said, well, my job is to go back to see you. And again, I met here's another incident for you, a man who's from Zimbabwe, and he's a United States citizen. But he says, geez, in my country, a representative I never even seen or heard, but he get to talk with me directly. And he goes, this is incredible. And I said, that's correct. My job is to meet you personally and hear your concern, and I bring it back. And I do. When I hear the concern of my constituent, I bring it back to the state level and make stuff happen, or try to.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I guess it's not only, since some of you said, it's not only the leaders who shape the course of the country, voters also can take part in that process. So when it's really upon us to raise our voices as well. I must apologize for running a bit over time, but the title of the discussion was Diversity in Leadership, and this panel was truly about diversity in leadership. And it was a valued opportunity for me, as well as for audience, I hope, to learn and get to know about America through your voices and insights. So thank you very much for this valued opportunity. Please give a big round of applause to our panelists today. Thank you very much.